Hey everyone, thank you for joining us on this webinar. My name is Barine Majewska. I'm an attorney at Vicente LLP. I'm one of the co-leads of our psychedelic-based practice group, along with Josh Capel, who's a founding member of the firm. I'll let my co-panelists introduce themselves and then we'll dive in.
Hello, everyone. Deidra Somerville. I'm the Executive Director at Alchemy Community Therapy Center. Good to be with all of you today.
And I'm Irina Alexander, she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the co-founders of Alchemy Community Therapy Center and the clinical director, and also work there as a therapist, and also work at the Harm Reduction Therapy Center doing street-based therapy in San Francisco.
Thanks again, everybody, for joining us on this very important topic of equity and access in the psychedelic field. Irina and Deidra are doing wonderful work over at Alchemy, so we're thrilled to have them presenting here. And we'll talk a lot about the details, but I just wanted to spend a few minutes setting up kind of the high level concern here, right? Like, why is equity so important? Why is this something that we all need to care about? As you guys know, this new wave of psychedelic use and therapies and access is blooming in the US right now. And we at the firm, and I know Deidra and Irina and everyone at Alchemy really cares a lot about understanding who we're leaving behind as this sort of wave opens and who we're excluding from access to these psychedelic therapies. And in my mind, there's sort of three large buckets of people. You know, there's obviously more, but these are the three sort of big areas of concern in terms of who's not getting the access that they might need. Socioeconomically disadvantaged communities, BIPOC communities, and LGBTQ plus communities, right? These are clearly outside of the sort of ready access that other folks are getting to these therapies as it starts to spread across the US. And then there's an additional sort of special case of indigenous populations that I think is worth mentioning, that we should all sort of be aware of and sensitive to. It's a specific problem in that a great deal, although not all, of the psychedelic practices and medicines and traditions that are being used in the West right now are borrowed from marginalized indigenous populations. And these practices had and continue to have deep historical roots and sacred significance to the people that engaged with them. And sadly, the way that this is unfolding in the US today, it may leave many members of these indigenous practices out, like sort of isolated from the practices that were taken from their very own cultures, right? So this is a particularly sensitive topic that we're trying to be aware of. And it's really important that we don't forget the contribution of these cultures, you know, voluntarily or involuntarily, to the development of these practices that are being so widely used right now. And on this topic, it's worth noting that Prop 122 in Colorado, also known as the Natural Medicine Health Act, as it was passed, contained very clear but very high-level equity mandates around reciprocity for Indigenous communities. But how it's implemented is going to depend on the advisory board. The actual equity plan, the nuts and bolts of it, isn't written yet, but it is supposed to comply with the intent that was passed. So it's going to need to be thoughtfully created by the advisory board, and specifically its equity subcommittees. So if this specific topic of Indigenous reciprocity is an important piece of the equity piece for you, if you'd like to get involved, please follow the formation and the work product of the equity subcommittee in Colorado as that's developed, because that will be key. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to just talk about some of the factors that make this broader access difficult, right? There's a lot of factors, but again, I think these are some of the key points. Cost, as many of you know, these are often extremely expensive treatments. Skilled facilitation in terms of what makes it safe and effective, like the level of skill required there is often very expensive. Facilitators often charge $150, $200 an hour or more, and it's a multi-hour experience. If you're talking about a psilocybin journey, it can often be a 6-hour, like you need 6 hours of facilitation or more just for the session. Again, we often find that skilled facilitation requires pre-sessions and post-session work as well, right? So that's an additional cost. So you're talking about a level of expense that's inaccessible to a lot of people. Availability, obviously, right? This is only slowly becoming legal, even where it's legal. Many places, you know, if you go to certain parts of Colorado, even though it's legal, you may not find skilled facilitators or skilled ceremonial folks who are trained in the tradition. An additional problem is that facilitators are very often not trained on the specific needs and sensitivities of minority populations. It's just not, it may not be part of the training they got from their mentors or from their facilitation training programs or their universities. And this ties, if you could just pop over to the next slide, this ties to a bigger problem that research and practice models that a lot of this is being based on right now. A lot of our modern understanding of this is being based on research models that only work with narrow populations. So while psychedelic research is constantly expanding and currently very promising, there are real shortcomings that folks are becoming aware of in how the research explores the impact of the substances on different populations, right? We may not understand yet what the best set and setting is for people with different backgrounds or people with different trauma histories or different life circumstances. And this is a problem even broader than psychedelics. For non-psychedelic research, just general research, several meta-studies have found that research studies are comprised of majority white participants and significantly majority, right? Not 51%, but often greater than 75%. And in psychedelic research, as this slide shows, the situation is even worse. A meta-study recently found that 82.5% of participants in psychedelic studies were non-Hispanic white, right? So the very research that a lot of times folks are basing the training programs or like clinic protocols and stuff on, that research itself is not representing a diverse population of folks. So both economic and racial diversity may not be properly addressed in these psychedelic clinical trials, and that's going to be something that needs to get addressed moving forward just on the research side. And if we can pop back to the last slide, 2 other points. Even if we do understand what skillful facilitation is, the life circumstances that a client is in may make integration difficult. So one example that I know Deidra and Irina have a lot of experience with is an impoverished or homeless population. You know, like even if the facilitation is perfectly tailored to their needs, we may not yet understand the different integration needs that are there when they go back to their existing life circumstances, or someone living in a traumatic situation. Even if we can really help them have a safe and effective treatment session, we may not understand yet what makes it safe for them to go home and like take advantage of that period of neuroplasticity in a way that's safe for their home life. So we'll be hearing a lot more about these types of issues. And then, of course, there's, you know, very valid mistrust and stigma among different populations of this kind of therapy. The war on drugs very heavily and disproportionately impacted the African-American community in the US. There's a history of really horrible abuse, even in a research context. There's studies in Kentucky that were using incarcerated Black men for extremely dangerous and unethical psychedelic research in the past. And hopefully, you know, we are always hoping that nothing like this is happening again, but there's a real trauma history around psychedelics in particular, in addition to all the other sort of class, culture, race trauma that we carry in this country. So that's worth being aware of. And then more generally speaking, just to quote one more interesting study, in 2013, researchers found that participants who reported a lifetime use of any psychedelic, so having any contact with psychedelic medicine over the course of their life, were significantly more likely to be young, white, single men with higher income and more education. So that leaves out really broad groups of people, minorities, women, socioeconomic and education differences in terms of who just encounters these substances in their daily life and who might have an understanding based on their own life experience that, hey, this might be worth something exploring as treatment becomes more legal and widely available. So I'll just wrap that up by saying the lack of diversity and access in this new wave of psychedelic treatment is not only unfair and unjust and possibly, you know, perpetuating old injustices and old traumas, but it also limits our ability to deeply understand the role of these medicines in our current time. We won't really understand the promise and the risks of what we're doing here until we can safely and fairly provide these treatments to a much wider scope of humans than we're currently. So the rest of this webinar will be about kind of the mechanics and the how from a group that's working very hard to actually make that happen. So with that, I'll pass it on to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that context for the work that we're going to discuss today. And I think what is feeling is we're distilling. So we've been at the top and widest end of the funnel. And by the end of today and end of our conversation, we'll get down to the more narrow end of it, where we really see where a lot of the synthesis of all of these ideas come into action and practice with what we're doing in community. So at first, before I move into my slides, I'd like to first acknowledge that we are an organization in what's called Oakland, California, but we acknowledge that we are on Ohlone land. We acknowledge that there are still people who are Ohlone, who are still here, who are still fighting, who are still acknowledging that their place belongs here in the way and in the practices that best affirm them as people, and that we affirm their right to resist all the tyranny that they experience and all of the problems that come with colonization that they currently have as an ongoing battle and struggle with. And I also want to acknowledge as a Black woman that I am a descendant of folks who have been here and who have labored here. And I want to acknowledge that there are still ongoing trauma and concerns around extracted labor in our communities that have ongoing trauma in all of our communities. And I want to acknowledge all of those who have battled and struggled to find parity when we have had an operational disadvantage to do that for so long because of the ways that our origin stories in this country. So I want to acknowledge all of my brothers and sisters who descend from those legacies, as well as my own legacy and descendant from that. So now that I feel like I've grounded us into who and where we are in terms of time and space, I'd like to talk a little bit about what delivering on this promise of equity and access looks like. And for our organization, it's Alchemy Community Therapy Center based in Oakland. One of the things that I think we're very intentional about is that there's a lot of discussion about getting the treatments to the people and to different communities, but I think our practice of how we treat and connect with each other as human beings helps us in doing that equitably and in ways that we acknowledge our humanness is where we start. So for me, I call that starting at home. So even before we talk about how we're looking at access and treatment, how are we looking at our organizations and how they function? Do they function with the same intention and practices that we're talking about are necessary in the communities that we're working with? So if we have a organizational culture that is unnecessarily hierarchical and shifts and has a power dynamic that centers whiteness and white supremacy and centers ways that alienate those within that organization from even feeling a part of whatever change in mission and value system that we're espousing to show to people outside of our organizations, then what are we really doing? Are we really centering the values and the systems that we create to work in those communities so that we represent ourselves authentically from the place of value that we're saying that we're espousing through this work that we're doing? So I want to center that as a value and center that as part of delivering on the promise of equity and access. So what approaches to management do we have? And organizational engagement. Do we have a organizational structure that values voices that oftentimes are not centered in conversations and decision-making? And yes, it gets complicated for lots of reasons in terms of how to do that, but do we have an intention to set in our approach to the work that has that as part of its value system? So I want to challenge everyone to really consider and look at that. Look at the organization. If you're out there and you're looking to do this work, how are you representing from the inside out as much as you are from what people see from the outside in? If you have questions about what does liberatory-based practice look like, what does diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging look like? Seek out the answers for yourself. Seek out the answers and even if you're working with organizations that do that work, challenge those organizations to see how they're actually trying to do that work. Because I think when we talk about equity and access, we have to start from a basis of a value system that not only looks good on the outside, but actually strives to be that on the inside. So that's one challenge that I think delivering on the promise really does have to do a lot of work on. And I actually don't hear a lot of discussion about that in this field yet. And I'd love to see more of it. And hopefully we can have a good conversation about that today in the time we have together. And I'm sure Irina and I and Barine would be glad to continue these conversations even after our call today. In terms of how do we value and embody the mission beyond diversity hires, that's what I mentioned. So how do we actually make sure that we have voices and practices and inclusion that not only centers the physical aspect of a person that makes an organization look diverse, but how do we value different voices? How do we value different perspectives? How do we value different ways that we show up in this work and have everyone feel safe in those environments? We talk about this being about psychotherapy and all of that. And sometimes the work that we're doing for others, we need to do for ourselves too, right? You know, so so we can never leave that work behind. And we all know that the medicines aren't the cure-all, right? We still got to walk through the door of change that we're actually needing to make for ourselves. So ask of ourselves what we ask of our folks that we're working with, and be honest about that, right? Be honest about where we are. Do our values and mission really reflect what we're really wanting to talk about? And leading with the love ethic, that's at the basis of all of this, right? That's something that I hold very personally as a part of my practice in working with Alchemy and Alchemy's therapists and team and all the team, and in any opportunity I have to engage with anyone's connect with our organization. So how do we center that love ethic? How do we value other people? How do we show compassion? How do we show care? How do we show a human-centered way of being and coexisting? And really making sure that the medicine isn't the only facilitator of that, because we have a lot of power in our own ways of being that gives us permission to be that too. So we just have to connect with that and use that as part of our platform when we're talking about expanding on these medicines and how they work in terms of equity and access. Next slide. So once we get past that, then we get down to the work in terms of the organizational level, right? We're building the funnel down. So now we're talking about what does it mean to actually take all those good intentions and put them into a structure that actually reflects what's possible for equity and access. So we are a sliding fee scale clinic, which means that at this very moment, we still have people who are actually receiving psychedelic-assisted therapy and psychotherapy for as little as $15 a session. And for us, we have a sliding fee scale that we actually have to look at, not only in terms of what we're asking people to pay, but across the spectrum up to $200. So what works for each clinic in terms of if you're looking at a sliding fee scale, each clinic has to look at what is our break-even point? Where is the point where we really can look at our full spectrum of offerings for how much people pay? And where is the point where we can say we really should have as many folks, honestly, at the top end of our scale as we do at the bottom end of our scale? Because we work with so many folks who really need a lot of these medicines, we've had a very our scale has tipped very heavily towards that $15 through $60 band in terms of payments. And so one of the things that we've had to work through, and that's been a work in progress, is figuring out where is that parity, knowing that we want to still serve those folks who really need us the most, but knowing also that sustainability means looking at our entire sliding fee scale in as equitable a way as we can. And I can tell you that we don't have all the answers to what that looks like yet, but we are really striving very hard to maintain our value center and our intention and our work and what we do, but also acknowledging that we need folks who also can help on that top end of that sliding fee scale to make sure that we can support those on the lower end of that fee scale. So that's something that we are working through right now. In terms of insurance models, that's something that we got out ahead of that gate, right? I know that there's some percolating conversations right now, but we are in it right now. So until those conversations materialize into access to insurance through our work, we have to continue to negotiate relationships with those who are willing to work with us. So we are in the state of California, and Medi-Cal has different organizations that one can partner with as an organization to have their members who are eligible through Medi-Cal to sign up for services. And so we are at the precipice of working with a local provider who actually is very enthusiastic to work with us. And so we can have up to this point, everything, we can have the integration covered through, and Irene, if I get any of this wrong, please correct me, but we can have everything but the actual ketamine assisted therapy sessions covered. We can have the prep sessions covered, and we can have the integration covered. And our psychotherapy sessions can be covered through that. So we're establishing our presence as a practice group with Medi-Cal through our clinicians in order to give more opportunities for those who cannot afford up to $50 per session, a chance to who are eligible to use Medi-Cal to cover the majority of the sections that they would actually have, which will help us to cover our expenses and also help that person who would not be able to afford it to actually access those treatments. So we're in the process right now, chugging along, getting more of our folks involved with that process. And so we're going to start seeing the gains of that once we have more folks who are actually signed up. But so the insurance model for us so far has been to really find a partner who's really willing to work with us. They're actually very interested in more referrals. And the other side of that insurance model question is infrastructure, right? What infrastructure does an organization have to actually manage that relationship? And that's something else that's a work in progress for us. An infrastructure that really has somebody who could make sure that the paperwork burden for our clinicians isn't so heavy, right? We have a lot of part-time staff, so we have a lot of layering of responsibilities in terms of how we manage these processes. But our capacity and sustainability as it continues to grow, we will have a structure that actually can support an insurance model that can ensure that we have clinicians that can focus on the clinical work and administrators that can actually support those clinicians as they work through those processes. So that's something that we're working through right now. But the majority, I think at last count, 71% of our client population actually is on our lower end of our sliding fee scale, because that majority of our clients make less than $25,000 per year. And for those of you familiar with California, particularly Northern California, you know that that's well below the median income here. The median income in Oakland, I believe, is $60,000 or so. So another part of this model that for us reflects equitable lens is the fact that we have paid internships, clinical internships for our clinicians who are primarily BIPOC and or LGBTQIA+. So for us, many of us, and some of you here likely have gone through the same thing, gone to grad school, paid and are still paying on those loans. And so we figure we go against the grain and not actually further put more financial burden on communities that are least able to access training and also least able to access opportunities for getting into this field, and particularly those who are unlicensed. So we make sure that the paid training helps to relieve that burden to the greatest extent that we can. and honor the work that they're doing in the community. We've had enough extracted labor, really. So we want to make sure that we do our best to honor the labor that they're providing to community that we know that they will continue to work with. So finally, in terms of funding strategies, our funding strategies are, for this field, I have a fundraising background. And so one thing that I've been struck by in this field is how often we have folks who have these funders that give these six-figure, five-figure gifts, and now that really has defined a lot of the ways people engage in funding in terms of these investors that are putting large amounts of capital behind startups. But traditionally, fundraising doesn't work that way. Traditionally, and especially for nonprofits, and those of you interested in nonprofits, the real opportunity for gaining access in terms of equity access and fundraising is really a grassroots-based fundraising process and strategy. So oftentimes you'll see in fundraising pyramid, you'll see a pyramid where the apex has the smallest proportion of people, but the largest amount of donors, where the largest amount of time is spent. And so what we like to do is flip that pyramid so that the largest amount of time and opportunity for engagement is with community, and with folks who don't have those large dollars but want to contribute in meaningful ways to this work. And so there are lots of ways that one can do that. There are ways to have community teach-ins. There are ways to we're looking at some strategies. We're looking at putting together a playlist that we're asking people to donate to, that we're going to put forth during the month of what the Mental Health Awareness Month. So there are different ways to be creative and find ways to provide the most opportunity for folks to be engaged in the work that we're doing, while also giving those larger investors a space in our work too, but emphasizing ways that we can actually be more community-centered in how we provide opportunities for giving. And also with that, making sure that we reach communities of color who want to give too. There's a lot of emphasis in this space on white men and giving. And that definitely needs to change, because there's a huge and there's a rich history of philanthropy in communities of color. And I think this field owes itself the opportunity and pleasure to really engage in rich opportunities for engagement with those communities as well. And with that, we're going to switch to Irina, who's going to give us more of what's at the bottom end of that funnel.
Oh my gosh, Deidra, whenever I hear you talk about Alchemy, I have this like emotional experience where I'm like, oh my God, that organization sounds so cool. I wish I could work for them. And I'm like, oh my God, I do work for them. And then I'm like, whoa, I'm so grateful. Oh, thank you for like setting all of that up. And it feels really cool to do this in like a kind of that funneled way, so that I can now talk about like specifically the client work. But before even going into the client work, I want to talk about like where we're at as a society in terms of psychedelic assisted therapy. And we're in a pretty weird place because not only is psychedelic therapy opening up more, but also we're in a structure of capitalism that's oftentimes almost all of the times dehumanizing to people and manipulative, and kind of pulls people in. And when you mix that in, when you mix in money with psychedelics, it turns into like almost this like other type of beast. Which you can see here on this slide. This is a slide that's taken from a training that Dr. Vilmarie Farguada-Narlock and I did for psychedelic support, and you can find it online. There's a slide at the end of this about how you can find it. But That Ville-Marie is also from Sana Healing Collective, which is another really awesome nonprofit psychedelic therapy clinic. But we talk really in that training about the risks and benefits of psychedelic therapy. And we have this slide up in there because this is really like where we are at with psychedelic therapy, right? So if you look, there's like, these are Instagram ads, you know, there's like a ketamine restorative yin yoga starting at $4.49. Like I got that Instagram ad targeted at me, which is also hilarious because now I have all of these friends who just like send the most ridiculous psychedelic therapy ads to me. One of my favorites is the legal psychedelics and sparkling water. And there's this like mycology psychology, which is just regular like healing mushrooms, but they're not psychedelic mushrooms, you know. So there's this kind of like things being sold as psychedelics, this silver bullet sort of idea of like, you know, before I started ketamine therapy, I felt like I had run up against a wall. It felt like 5 years of therapy in just a few sessions, you know. So that's what like people are coming into treatment with, is holding this perspective of, you know, I've tried everything else, but psychedelic therapy is going to be the thing that saves me. Psychedelic therapy is going to be the one thing that gets me what I haven't been able to get. And I think at our organization, we really face the realities individually and with clients of like, you know what, psychedelics are a tool. They're a really powerful tool. They're a really appropriate tool in some cases. And we really hold the model of psychedelic-assisted therapy, not psychedelics as the thing, but the therapy and the relationship and the love and the care, and the consistency, you know, and the flexibility. All of that is really what we have to give. And then sometimes ketamine can be a helpful tool as part of that process. But especially when working with underserved populations, the question is really, how do we offer that in a way that's safe? And who gets to define safety? And how much of a foundation do people need to build before introducing a psychedelic into their treatment, which can really open up a lot of parts of someone's subconscious experience. And especially, you know, if people don't have a solid foundation of maybe even a home to go back to that feels safe enough afterwards, or money to spend on more integration sessions, or a community that can actually hold that, whatever it is that does come up from their psyche afterwards, then things can get really dangerous. So I think, you know, I found myself more and more in this kind of weird place over the past few years of holding this like almost like trying to like pull in more of the risks of psychedelic therapy, especially as we're talking about access, while at the same time trying to balance out like, yes, there are benefits. I mean, there can be benefits. We've seen it with our clients. I've worked with so many clients from so many different walks of life, so many different symptoms coming in, and it's been magical. It really has been. I honestly, personally, I'm not someone who's really sold on ketamine before starting to do ketamine therapy. I was kind of like, whatever, you know, like let's get to MDMA. That's the one that I want to work with eventually. But then when I started actually doing ketamine assisted therapy with clients, I was like, oh crap. Okay. Okay. This is actually a pretty cool drug too. And you know, one of the things of it too is that it lasts a shorter amount of time. So people in a way, it kind of sets itself up to be more accessible in that, you know, because people don't have to pay for 8 hours of therapy, they can pay for 3. They don't have to maybe take off a whole 2 days of work. They can maybe just take off 1. You know, there are a lot of things about it that I really enjoy. They can select their own dose within a range and really develop a relationship with the medicine because we prescribe it in lozenge form. So anyway, I could go on and on, but if we want to go to the next slide, actually. So we're, you know, in this context of capitalism, psychedelic therapy, we're all kind of finding our way. And at the same time, the more shadow side of psychedelic therapy has also been coming into I'd say like the front of society's consciousness and into our awareness. And there's a lot of boundary crossing that happens also in regular therapy, but then you add in psychedelics, which put people into a vulnerable place. Oftentimes folks might regress back into, you know, past childhood feelings or really uncomfortable territory that's filled with trauma and is really, really sensitive to holds. And then, you know, you add in someone who's coming in claiming that they're a guide or a sitter, right? And that relationship between the two of them also poses its own set of risks. There are some people for which psychedelic therapy with another person in the room actually isn't the best fit. See, here I go again being like, oh, psychedelic therapy is scary, don't do it. But I think it's really important to lean into this side so that we can do it right and so that we can do it ethically, and so that we don't put our clients at risk and we talk about things in a transparent way with consent every single step of the way. Okay, we can do next slide. So then there's this question of like, okay, so what do we do with all of this? Right? There's the good, there's the bad, there's the ugly, there's the beautiful, there's everything in between. And what I like to talk about, also Sauna Healing Collective likes to talk about, is this concept of assessing in instead of screening out. So what's happening now in the psychedelic world, from what I've experienced, what I've seen, is that there are two extremes. On one extreme, certain organizations, certain clinics, especially like the online virtual ketamine therapy ones, are just like screening everyone in. You know, it's like, yeah, sure, like just pay us a lot of money and we'll give you drugs. On the other hand, with no therapy, even as part of it, right? On the other hand, there are practitioners who are really afraid to work with more vulnerable populations. So they're just screening everyone out. And they're like, hey, you've got to be like just depressed, no trauma, have stable housing, have lots of money, et cetera, or else I don't feel safe working with you. So what you know, I want to get to in this training, and also is available in the psychedelic support training that Bill Marie and I did, is this idea of how do we work with clients collaboratively to really like help develop that foundation for them to be able to do this work safely. Because if you think about it, the foundation that folks need to be able to do psychedelic therapy work safely is actually the same foundation that people need to just like live a happy life a lot of the time. Because what we're talking about is like, how do you build enough capacity in someone to feel big feelings, to, you know, welcome in joy, to connect with community, to maybe ask for help when something vulnerable happens. All of those things are at the core of therapy, I think, before we even welcome in psychedelics. So there's really this question of like, how do we do that in a way that helps engage the client and helps them assess for themselves, like, hey, like, do you feel safe enough? And hey, what if you do have a hard time? Where would you go for help? And what does that look like? And what resources do you have? And then this gets to point number 2, which is this concept of psychedelic social work of, okay, you don't have access to those resources. Let me help you connect you to those resources. Because how can someone do therapy if they're not even eating daily, right? Like how there's so many therapists that kind of like separate that out of like, I'm just a mental health practitioner, so I'm not going to talk to my clients about whether or not they have a place to sleep or a place to eat or basic needs met. And I really want to break that apart and say like, all therapists should be social workers. You know, like that's, especially when working with underserved populations, it's, to me, it feels unethical to not participate in some way, to give referrals, to help connect them with case managers, to, you know, really help build those resources in a client's life. Because how can someone feel like you care about them if you don't even care about their basic well-being? Right? So the third point of that too then is collaborating with the client. So really collaborating with them, not imposing your own sense of what safety is. You know, you are a professional too, so I'm not saying not to bring in your professional perspective at all, but how to do that in a loving, caring, collaborative way of like, hey, like I'm feeling a little concerned about what you might do after the session. I want to make sure that you have enough support afterwards. How can we work together to help build that for you? You know, as opposed to saying like, again, one way or the other, like, oh yeah, you feel safe, that's fine, that's fine. Or, you know, like, oh, I don't feel that you're safe enough, therefore I'm not going to continue with this. And the biggest thing with all of this is that it takes time. It takes a lot of time. So we also oftentimes have really long-term therapy relationships with clients, which again goes against the grain of what capitalism wants us to do. And a lot of times goes against what maybe funders might want us to do. You know, people want immediate results. People want to see like in and out, we fixed the problem, we've moved them along. But the clients that we're talking about are in a constant state of being impacted by systemic trauma. So there's no way to move them along. Like we need bigger systemic change. My roots are in drug policy reform, so I think about things in a systemic way. But this is at least, you know, one way in which we can kind of shift our perspective on how we work with individuals and give them the support that they really deserve. Go to the next slide. So if you do your little phone scanning thing, this will link you to a document that Ville-Marie and I made together. It's called Assessing In. So it basically runs you, oh, I can do a little screen share here, actually, let me do that. Everyone see that? Okay, yeah, okay. So this is a document that goes through questions that folks might want to ask their clients when really getting curious about what a person's life is like. There are questions about the drug in particular, about the set, so internally where they're at before they go into a psychedelic session, about the setting, and then about the relationship between the two of you. So I won't spend a bunch of time going into all of those, but how do I turn this share off now? Oh gosh, where are we? There we go. Sorry, stop share, there we go. Aha. But yeah, so that's a document that you can check out a little more during your own time. Or again, yeah, the second post right there is the training that I've been talking about, exactly that one on the right. And also just to make a plug, we have a training coming up for licensed providers starting in May. I'm super excited about it. We have such a diverse staff of clinicians who are going to be training, who all have years of ketamine experience under their belts. So please help us get the word out and share, because like Deidra was saying, this is also another part of how we actually financially make this model sustainable, is that like everything else we, you know, try to provide at a sliding scale model, and then the ketamine training is an opportunity for people to pay for training if they're licensed and have 100% of those funds go straight into supporting accessible and equitable psychedelic therapy. So please pass it along, please sign up. We've got folks signing up already. So yeah, could use support in that. So I think that's all I got.
I see one question, someone's asking about how can folks support Alchemy in its vision and goals? And there are a number of ways you can do that. We are a nonprofit, but we are a 501c3 organization, and I will shamelessly say that we definitely are accepting donations. We on occasion have opportunities for volunteers, but given how we operate, we don't have a huge volunteer base that we rely on for in-person connection to work with us. But we're happy to expand that with any and all any and all offerings that you all would be interested to provide to us. We're great. We've had donated furniture. We've had a number of things along those lines. We had a paint party recently. We're trying to have another paint party soon. So that we're very open to connecting with people in community in a way that helps you all feel fulfilled and happy to support us, because it's an opportunity to give, is an opportunity to receive, definitely. So however that shows up is great. We're in the process of looking at partnerships here in the Oakland Bay area, and standing those up and providing even more opportunities for engagement with folks outside of our immediate clinical and organizational context. And so we're still defining what that is, but we're very happy to connect with anyone who's interested in advancing the work that we do. Tell folks about the training. If you're interested to tell folks about the training, please do. We welcome that for sure. We'd love to have, we have a bunch of folks who we know were aware of it. We're always interested to expand our reach to different folks who are discovering this work and discovering how to do it through the lens that we offer. So we're very happy to do that.
Yeah, I'd say sometimes one of our downsides is that we're like a little too humble as an organization. So like I'm like so bad at the whole promoting marketing thing, and like, yeah, speaking of capitalism, so like seriously, if you all could take like a moment to just like send that training to like one licensed healthcare provider that they need to have at least 1 year of mental health experience, but it can be MDs, it can be psychiatrists, it can be social workers, therapists, but yeah, we need some help kind of getting the word out about that, because it's gonna be really good. It is.
Right. I see a question from Suzanne. Is it Suzanne? It looks like it's Suzanne Cummers, about community donations versus big investors. Suzanne says they're getting more familiar with the world of big investors, and do we see, or do I see opportunities there? Yes, there are opportunities there. And we've had some great opportunities for engagement with some pretty large players in this space. And the thing about psychedelic-assisted therapy and working with these bigger funders is that it's kind of the same people, if I can be honest. There aren't any emerging large investors in this space. And if I gave you a pie chart right now to show you, and Barine, I'm sure, can attest to this, where the mass majority of and this reflects a lot of what we're talking about. We're fighting a tidal wave that is around capitalism, that is around maintaining the status quo, which is very honestly white supremacy, right? So if I were to draw a pie chart for you right now, you can see there, in terms of emphasis in community-based healing and or healthcare, that sliver is made very, very small, right? But the vast majority of that pie is going towards research and for-profit entities that are growing very, very fast, and getting a lot of folks getting access to a lot of these medicines to a lot of people in very efficient ways. So because that larger pie is really focused on those areas, that's where a lot of the emphasis of folks entering this field is. And so it's almost like a cycle. The more of that of what's available is what is drawn. It's attractive to funders because of the impact that it will have, because of the return on investment that it has. I think when we talk about kind of articulating what return on investment is, it doesn't center capitalism in this world. right? In terms of the work we do. We don't center capitalism as return on investment. We center community in terms of return on investment. So there's a bit of an altruistic piece to what we do and how we approach this work that funders that are interested in funding like the big splashy research, clinical trials, all of that, they won't get that gratitude with us. And so, so we're hoping that, and there are some players who are definitely interested in the work that we do and interested to see it succeed. We're looking for them, and hopefully they're looking for us. And for those we have worked with, they've been generally very pleased in working with us. So I think the context is important, Suzanne, in terms of this question of these larger investors versus the community-based fundraising, because those pieces are very differently placed in terms of value systems that inform the work in the space and how we situate ourselves in it in terms of being a community mental health clinic in the psychedelic space. Hope that answers your question. Irina and Barine, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just had the challenge of defining what success is and how to remain client-centered in that definition when donors might want something else, right? And I think oftentimes of this one example where I was doing outreach work with a previous organization that I worked with, and for 6 years we would see the same client on outreach every single outreach night, and we would say hi to him, he would wave, he wouldn't really say anything, and 6 years later he called our office, and our office, like one of the counselors like picked up, and like put him on hold, and she like announced to the whole office, like, this person is calling, and we all just like screamed and clapped. So like, how do you even begin to communicate to a donor, like, this is what success is, and this is what to put your money in? Because like what we're talking about is like the depth of relationships, and we're talking about love, and we're talking about support, and we're talking about working with people who, like I was saying, are constantly in a state of active trauma. So you can't have the same levels of expectations for folks that we're working with, for folks who are victims of systemic trauma on the regular, as like, oh, you need to like get a job and go to college and whatever, right? And I've seen a lot of organizations unfortunately fall victim to that, I'd say, of like, oh, after this many sessions of therapy, this percentage of our clients is now applying to school. And I'm like, first off, how do we know that they want to apply to school and that's their actual individual goal? And second off, why are we using that as a marker of success as opposed to asking them, like, hey, what does success look like to you? And for one person, that might just mean showing up to therapy every once in a while. Great, let's celebrate that. It's like Dan Big, who is a really big harm reductionist person who really like was one of the people who like got Narcan, the life-saving opioid overdose reversal drug, out to communities. He would always say, any positive change, right? So like any single tiny little positive change in a person's life is what we live for, is what we're here for. But then how to like take that and communicate it to people who have money and want to donate to organizations, especially when they're looking for those like direct numbers of like, well, I gave you $1. What did that dollar do? It's like, well, that dollar like help someone feel loved. It's like,
Right.
and
Measure.
help them achieve their own goals, right? Help them achieve
Right.
like their own individual goals, as opposed to goals that we're putting onto them or that society is putting onto them. Exactly.
Right. And I'd like to close by saying thank you, everyone, and I'll let Barine close out everything, but I just like to just do another appeal for the work that we do, and people, and even though we ask people, we have a sliding fee scale that acknowledges money as part of the exchange for treatment. I just also like to remind everyone, remembering our land acknowledgement, remembering the acknowledgement of labor and acknowledgement of trauma, that when we ask people who have given so much, not only through themselves, but ancestrally, being connected to those who have given so much and saying you have to pay some more, we should remember that they have paid enough, right? And our goal isn't to get them to be deserving of what we're offering them. our goal is to get to some idea of healing, right? And so I hope that, you know, those who want to give to us are giving to us to help us to get to that parity, to say folks who have paid already and are paying enough, can we make it so that they can just have therapy, reduce those barriers and access to barriers like that psychedelic social work piece, along with opportunities through philanthropy and others, so that people don't have to continue to pay for things that we are that honestly, that they should not have to pay for in addition to everything else. So let's just keep that. I just want to keep that in mind and thank everyone for coming today. Thank you for the love. I appreciate the love that you all are showing.
Thank you, Deidra and Irina, so much. And thank you, everyone who participated. I can also feel the love. I've never seen so many hearts go through a webinar and in the chat and stuff. So I think you guys are really, feeling the energy that we were hoping to put this webinar on from. And we so appreciate your participation. Please reach out to any one of us. I know I'd personally be happy to respond to any questions or, requests for connection. So.
Definitely.
And Irina and Deidra's emails are up there as well. So please stay in touch. And thank you again so much for participating, all of you.
Thank you very much.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.